Hello, welcome to my studio. Well, I guess it's actually just digitally you're welcome to my studio. For those of you who haven't been here in a while, it's good to have you back. For those of you who've never been here before, I'm in the small part of my studio where I do lots of matting and framing and that kind of thing, and also design work, and also where I work on sketches to prep them for matting and framing. And it's also where some of you may know me from because this is also where I teach from when I'm doing digital classes. So, again, welcome. This particular video that I'm about to present to you is actually converted from an old PowerPoint, but I've done an overdubbing, if you will, on top of it. And it's going to be an introduction to watercolor sketching. It's going to talk about different kinds of things that we might consider to be sketching and look at a number of different ways of working with watercolor as a sketching medium. And the second half of the presentation will actually be about materials, sort of the things we might want to think about as we're gathering materials to sketch in the studio, and more importantly for this particular class, also what we might want to take when we go outside to sketch. Not want to, we don't want to take a boatload or a truckload of things with us. We want to be able to concentrate on just the sketching when we do that. So that's what this one is going to be about, and I guess I should go ahead and turn it over to that part of the video. Again, thanks for coming. Talk to you again soon. Okay, why don't we jump on in and take a look at watercolor sketching here for a little bit. This sketch kind of gives us a reason to take a look at some of the various reasons we might be doing some sketching. Historically, one of the main reasons for sketching, and that sketching became so popular, is that it was a way to work out ideas ahead of time, to prepare for another larger, possibly more complex work of art. That's what happened here with that particular piece. The small sketch that you can now see on the left, combined with photographs and some notes I took at this particular location, led me to create this larger piece, this 30 by 40 watercolor that you see on the right-hand side. So the watercolor sketch led to a larger piece. It could have been an oil painting, it could have been any number of things, but the sketch was the sort of the jumping off point for that work. But the sketch itself, frankly, gives us another point of reference about what's going on with sketching. More modern artists often will sketch not to complete another piece, but to sort of work out an idea or to simply make an image that they are intrigued by. Imagine, if you will, a short piece of music, a short song that you enjoy listening to, or a small piece of poetry or a short story. Or maybe it's just this little tiny snippet of video that you enjoy watching on your phone. That's the same idea that often catches us with excitement, that sort of gives us the reason we want to sketch or to look at sketches. So what I would say is, as you're working with a sketch, whether it's in preparation for something else or as a finished product all on its own, think about it maybe with the idea of intentionality and passion. It's a place where we can work out an idea, where we can be very focused on what we're doing, we can be very excited by what we're doing. And I would recommend to anybody who wants to make sketches that you try to get to that intentionality and passion by probably concentrating most often on a degree of boldness combined with simplicity. We might, as I did in this one, work with the intentionality, with the concept, if you will, of simple colors, very, very plain and simple brushwork, rough and incomplete, if you will, and a very limited color palette, sort of yellow, green, and then maybe two kinds of blues, a bluish green and a violet blue, and a lot of gray and black, of course. So we might, if we're working through this, we might be thinking of practicing, as you see in here, a lot of loose brushwork, very, very bold and simple brushwork, or combining ink lines with washes. And that's what I see a lot of here. Lots of line, lots of loose washes, not making them look particularly finished everywhere, but letting the roughness actually be something that we're enjoying. Here, we're perhaps seeing images created directly with watercolor. No underlying pen lines or even pencil lines, just direct watercolor applied to the surface. Another kind of sketching that we will often find used is sort of journaling, note-taking, if you will, visual note-taking that you might find it for somebody who's doing a travel journal or doing some kind of, if you might think of as a research, looking at something and trying to come up with ideas and thinking about what they're looking at and seeing it, trying to see it in different ways. There are additional ways to define what a watercolor sketch is or does as well. We might consider this one fairly rough and incomplete. That might be a reason to do it. That might be one of the ways we work towards getting what we're looking for. This is a relatively small piece done by a friend of mine from college. It's small. That's one thing we might think of as a sketch. Another thing that may lead us to think of this one as a sketch is the large amount of white space. It doesn't look like it's finished in terms of everything being painted in, but it does feel pretty much finished in that everything seems to be intentionally placed in its place where it is. There's a couple little runs of color that we might not think of as appropriate for a finished painting, but in a sketch we're happy to quite maybe overlook that. But that's just one of the ways to think about it. Sometimes even a very large piece, and this one isn't really, really large, but it's a fairly large piece, but it seems to be roughly painted. Some people think of roughly painted as a way of thinking about sketching, sort of like when the artists who were trying to paint almost photographically in the middle 1800s looked at Impressionists and said, oh, those are just mere impressions, simple and rough things that are just essentially sketches. By the way, the Impressionists thought that was a high praise, frankly, and accepted the name for themselves. Here, we've got a different approach being used, and it's the idea, if you will, of that we see in different people in different cultures having more than one kind of approach to making an image and to making quick and simple images. So I would say there's no one particular style of sketching and no one firm, absolute definition for what is and isn't a sketch. Here, the piece is loosely painted, and while all of its details are kind of super simplified, it's got some definition of depth and space and certainly time of day and color, but it's not intended to have the details in each building and the small details of where every single window is or every single bit of blade of grass or what each and every tree or bush or house in the middle distance is doing. So it's not as complete, if you will. Maybe that makes it a sketch. Sometimes we might think of as incompleteness as a quality of sketching. We even see there's pencil lines that have not been painted in, and we certainly see the house to the back and then over to the left as being incompletely painted. It's a perfectly appropriate way for a sketch to exist because it's the idea, it's the beginnings of an idea sometimes. Now this piece has a lot more work done to it. It's got a lot of details in the rock, in the stone wall, and in the shadows up on the roof, and in the building in the back, and the sky behind that. So there's shadows,
Some of us might look at it though and say, "Oh, but it's not all perfectly worked out. Not all the things are painted in completely. I see pencil lines that are painted up to, but the pencil lines haven't been erased yet, or maybe that front wall is not completely worked out with every bit of detail being just completely articulated and finally put together." We might think that makes it a sketch. Others might look at it and go, "No, it's got too much detail and it's got too many things. It can't really be a sketch." Um, it's okay that we might even argue over a piece being a sketch or not. Certainly, if you're working to prep another piece of artwork, you might do multiple kinds of sketching: line sketching, value sketches. You might be doing some kind of working with a pencil and doing a wash or an ink sketch, trying to work out the image multiple ways to help you sort of figure out where you're going to go next. That works along nicely with your a reference photograph. So helping you get from one place to the next as you begin to put the image together in your head and finally on paper or canvas or whatever you're painting. Here, in fact, is an artist who's worked up a simple sketch. The line is basically the same line everywhere, so it's inarticulate in that way. It's unarticulated, might be a better way to say that. The lines do not have a lot of thickness and thinness variation within them to tell us anything. They're just lines that sort of go around the outside edges of shapes. And then, of course, the artist has done a whole lot of work with value. It's fairly simple value. I would say maybe five, four, five, six values. Sometimes there's some overlaying of gray washes, but a value scale, kind of rough and simple, but certainly easily understood value scale. It's a good sketch for something that might be done later. Notice they have signed it though. They like what they've done and are willing to show it to us. Now here is a piece. This artist is also concentrated, as the last one did, on a fairly narrow value scale and a fairly narrow color scale. Yes, it goes from yellow to orange and blues and greens, and even maybe some reds. There's even little hints of violet, but it's a fairly muted. Every color is fairly muted, and the value range is fairly narrow. Nothing gets super black except maybe some of those shadows in the trees on the upper left are close to black, but almost everything else is in a muted, bright light situation, like it's all washed out in sunlight, but not bright white either. So not a lot of strong contrast up against the whites to sort of say, I'm a bright sunny day and I got a lot of strong shadows. But I would look at this one, and while it is fairly simple and kind of roughly done, I look at it as more of a finished piece. But that's me. That's my opinion. Uh, some of my sketches I end up looking at and saying, well, they're really just small paintings. But you get to make those kind of decisions. That last piece was a plein air painting or a plein air sketch painted outside. And here you see you see one artist, but you see two different artists' work as they're painting a space. In fact, if you look very closely in the middle, you'll see two more painters or plein air artists, sketchers, that are sitting on the other side of the road in the shadows right in front of that building that these two artists seem to be painting. Uh, Plein air artists certainly are an interesting contrast to sketching in some ways because they almost insist on a wide range of materials and a set of gear that really lets them get something that makes a lot of sense and a lot more of a studio-like piece of artwork. They'll carry a lot of stuff with them. Sketchers often wish to go in a much simpler, much more simple approach to their work. That said, some of the cool toys, like this wonderful little adjustable viewfinder that plein air artists like to work with, might be a nice tool for us as sketchers. It wouldn't be a bad idea for some of us to use something like that occasionally. Not that I would look at my whole work through that, but maybe as you're getting started, trying to pick out exactly what you want to be working on, it's kind of fun to use those. That idea of taking a look at the tools we might want to use is probably one of the major points that I definitely want to get to here in this little presentation. The watercolor sketcher whether you're working in the studio or certainly if you're working outside, which I recommend a good bit to do, is you want to simplify your tools. You want to know what you're going to work with ahead of time, even if you're not sure exactly what you're going to paint ahead of time. By simplifying your tools, by simplifying your materials, what you do is you begin to move in the direction of limiting yourself, yes, but it's also a way to by carrying less, we can focus more. Here, this artist has a small watercolor palette. Looks like a water brush. That's a brush with water in the handle. And some paper towel, and then they've laid open their sketchbook. Notice they're painting on both sides of the sheet. This particular artist basically doesn't take their paintings ever out of the sketchbook. For them, the sketchbook is the be all and end all. They're not going to take these things apart because on the back side of the right side paper, on the back of that, there is the beginnings of a painting that's on the that goes full spread on the other side. So in this case, it's a situation where the sketchbook is never going to be dismembered and matted and framed. That's not the purpose of what they're doing. They're doing this as an object lesson, as an experimentation maybe, or an exploration of the world around them, and they're not trying to turn these things into fine art things that are going to be put on a wall in a frame and sell. But the tools they're using are very simple and very straightforward. Here, another artist, a slightly bigger painting gear. No, it looks like they have two palette pieces here, but they're using two brushes. One is a portable brush that's got a handle that so it's a travel brush. You can close it up. That's the one closest to the painting. And then the one on the other side of the palette there is just a short brush. And it looks like they've also got some pencils down below and a dip pen. It's a pen, but it's a wooden or bamboo dip pen for dipping in, not into ink, but actually dipping into their water or into their paint to actually draw thin lines with their paint. And obviously a small sketchbook here that they've kept from blowing around by putting a clip on it. Here is an artist's kit. You'll notice if you look at the larger photograph to the right, there's again a small palette that opens up and gives us some spaces to work with, and then some small tools, a little plastic bag with an eraser inside, some little small plastic things to hold water in next to the clip, and then the bag that holds these things in the back side. To the right, to the left, the actual bag fully loaded with all of its gear. Let's take a closer look at that. This is the bag that I actually own one of as well. I've actually owned two of them at different times. Mine tore because I've tried to load too much into it. It's kind of like this guy's doing on the right-hand side. That's a lot to put in that one little pocket. The pocket on the left is much deeper. But then it opens up and gives us a chance to look at both, have stuff in both sides. Here's somebody else's gear: a pencil, a mechanical pencil, a permanent ink pen, and a brush. One of those brushes that metal back actually comes off and then can safely store the front and protect the front end of the brush, and a little spray bottle or a bottle of water, and one little plastic cup to put their water in, a small portable plastic palette, and a mixed media paper sketchbook. This one's pretty good. It's 90-pound paper. I wouldn't want to do a lot of water on a 90-pound paper, but it's a mixed media paper that's good for dry material and watercolor as well, and for inks. So it's a good one. And actually, as small as it is, you're not going to get 100 pounds of water on it anyway. So that'll be a perfectly good weight for us to use. In terms of the watercolor, there's a lot of things we could be doing and working with here. What we're looking at is we're looking at an assortment, if you will, of a couple of different kinds of palettes here, and some other gear, and then the paint itself. Now, you can get, as you see on the right, you can get tubes of paint. These are small, high-quality, student-grade Van Gogh by Royal Talons. And to the left, you see some Winsor Newton watercolors, and I think there may be a second brand there as well. But I'm not a Lockrell. Oh, it's Sennelier. Okay, yeah, two very good brands. One out of France, one out of England. And those are little wrapped cakes of watercolor. You can see in the two palettes down below. One was just a pan that we've seen that one before, and then this other one it's actually a Winsor Newton pan that's got a actual water bottle up in the cap. You take the water bottle out, then you suddenly have a place to mix color in the lid. You take the water bottle out and you pour the water into that little cup that's on the side of the palette, and then you've got these other little parts of palettes that sort of the white bits that sort of fold out for an extra mixing trays. But the paint itself is wrapped in a tinfoil type material. It's a little cake, a moist cake. You can see them in the pans, the yellow pan, the pan with yellow in it, and the pan with black in it close to the tubes. You can see some empty pans down here below the tubes, and each of those is actually the rectangular ones that are longer are actually half pan sizes, and then the square ones are full pan sizes. They're actually larger. They look smaller, but they're larger. And the idea is you unwrap the paint and you stick it in the pan. The pan then sort of functions like a little bowl that the paint can stay in, and then you stick the pan into the palette in a location that you want to have for that particular paint. Here are some palettes as well. The one at the top on the left, the little tiny one, is very similar to the one that I use. But in fact, it's a one that we'll look at in a minute. It's a sort of, it was rigged by the artist. It's a non-purchasable palette. You can purchase the box, and then those little pans are just dropped into place and held in place either by tension or by putting magnets in it. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the one underneath it is an interesting one. It's a fairly large palette. I mean, look at that. It's got 9 on each side, and then so if you look at that, it's got 24 colors in it. And then it's got two little mixing trays that are in amongst the colors that have been squeezed out into the locations. By the way, you can squeeze out paint from a tube into those little pans we were looking at earlier. And then on the top of it, it's of this blue and white palette, it's actually got a removable tray. That white tray is removable, and underneath it is another surface for mixing color. So you've got a lot of color mixing places in this one, and that particular kind has a rubber gasket that holds the paint moist for longer. One on the right, the one on the right, which is sort of like one of my palettes, my studio palette. It is a metal tray that's enameled, and you can see they've squeezed out paint into each of those little places for paint. And it's got a little thing, looked like a little trapezoidal or almost square piece in the far right-hand corner up in that big mixing area. That's actually a place that you can then stick your thumb through. It folds out, and you can stick your thumb through it so you can sort of hold the palette in your hand and mix color. I don't tend to recommend that a sketcher have that many colors all the time. It's staying simple is not a bad idea sometimes. Keeping it simple, keeping it, maybe 3, 4, 6, maybe 9 colors at the most for me would be appropriate for a sketcher. But if you're a plein air artist and you want to sort of live on both sides of that world, that's great. Down below is an interesting one. The one on the bottom, on the sort of bottom and on the left, that one right there is actually an old palette, a very old style of palette. It's actually a palette, a school palette, one that you might have used when you were in elementary school. They have popped out the tray that held the watercolor. They tried it out, and then they've put in little pans, probably glued them down, or and then just put in paint from a tube in it, and stuck in two brushes and a little sponge, and then they can use that. It's small, it's highly portable, it's inexpensive, it's a good reuse of an old material. Uh, I've even seen some art students of mine just take an old kid's palette, watercolor tin, and then just get rid of any of the ancient, sort of the ancient color that was in it, and then fill up the little pans with tube color. Because if you're doing a sketch, you're probably not needing a lot of color, and you'll find out that watercolor goes a long way. Just a little bit goes a pretty long way. Here are some palettes and some little color pans, if you will, for putting color into. And like I said, you can put the hard or the semi-moist cakes in it, or you can just fill them up with the colors you want out of a tube. That way you don't have to carry your tubes everywhere. But the palette at the top is actually designed to have a total of 8 little color pans that drop into place, and they're sort of held in place by pressure. And then in the middle is supposed to be a place for a little foldable or collapsible watercolor brush. But like I've done with that very same palette, I put in 4 extras, like you see here. So this artist can carry 12 colors with them. To the left, there are 2 recycled tins. You might notice the one at the top, if you can read through it, looking at its top, you might notice that it's actually an Altoids tin. And they've started putting in both half pans and full pans. They look almost all the same, but just a little different. One's being square, one being longer and thinner. And then down below, I believe that's a Sucrets box with 9 color things in it. It actually has a nice little divide in the top that that keeps their colors apart from each other. I've even seen people do this trick where they'll take an Altoids tin or a Sucrets tin and just put in 3 or 4, maybe 5 little dabs of color, and that way that little box doesn't even have any little cups, of these pans to put in there. If you're using a pan, want to use pans, they're great. You can find some that have got little magnets on the bottom, or you can just go to the store or go online and purchase some little tiny little wafer thin magnets that are magnetized on both sides, or maybe they're magnetized on one side but have some glue on the back, and then you just put that on there, and that way it's easy to get them to stay still in your palette. Now, brushes. Brushes are something that I just love, having lots of brushes. I've owned a bunch. I've owned far more than I use on a regular basis. And if you're in the studio, it's a treat to have all kinds of brushes at your disposal for whatever you might need. A plein air artist or a watercolor sketcher, probably just simply from the standpoint of they need to trim down what they're taking, unless they're planning on taking 100 pounds of stuff with them. I know artists who take 4, 5, or 6 brushes. Plein air artists might take that many, or 1 or 2 more. I know sketchers who take 1 or maybe 3, but 3 or 4 would be sort of my max for doing watercolor sketching. Probably 1 small brush, but if you look at these different scales and sizes, notice that a larger brush, if it's a good one, can in fact come to a really fine point, so you might not need the smallest brush you think you have to have. If you've got a decent one like a number that 2 there, which is not a number 2 brush, but if that's the size you have, you really don't need the 1, because notice they come to the same kind of point. Those longer, thinner brushes, those bigger, moppier kind of brushes, they make different kinds of marks. So, having maybe the number 2 one there, or the 3, and then having a big fat, like the number 8 that you see over there, which is, like I said, it's not a real number 8 brush, but it's an oval wash brush or a mop style brush. And then it may be having a flat so that you get a different kind of mark. But you get the idea. Scaling it down a little bit. Here, if you're carrying brushes, you want to carry brushes in a way that doesn't let them get damaged very easily. You can wrap them up in cloth. You can wrap them up in some kind of bamboo mat, if you will. Here, somebody has actually run a ribbon through the mat, and then lets them slide the brushes underneath the ribbon. Then they can sort of wrap it up and then tie it so that the brushes don't fall around and get messy and get lost. Also, this also protects the fiber, the brush part, from getting mangled. Also, by not being a piece of cloth, but being open air like this is, it allows them to dry out a little bit. Here's a set of brushes. This is a combination of, on the left-hand side that you're seeing there, and on the left-hand picture, excuse me, the right-hand picture, but in the right-hand picture, the brushes to the left are actually some of those collapsible brushes. The back end kind of comes off and then goes over and protects the brush. The other brushes are standard watercolor brushes, pretty much, except for, I guess, there's one black one with a gold bit that's sort of in the middle, next to the biggest wide flat brush. I think that's also a collapsible brush, or a travel brush where the back end handle comes off and protects the brush. But the idea is to find some brushes, the ones you want to use. If you want to use those brushes, you don't have like a bamboo mat or a piece of fabric to wrap them in, or some kind of holder for them, you might very well consider putting them in a gallon plastic bag. The problem is that if they're floating around freely in the plastic bag, they might get bumped around, and you might mash it in some way and sort of damage the brush end. If you do that, slide something like a ruler or a hard piece of plastic or a hard piece of cardboard in with the brushes. That will allow the bag not to sort of fold over on the brushes, and it'll give you a little extra protection. You don't want your brushes to get mangled. Here is an actual container for brushes. Notice it's also got a pocket on the side. You could stick a couple of tubes of paint in. You could stick a pencil or two in. It's basically a pencil case, but it's made more for brushes. You do not have to necessarily be using a standard brush. Here in the middle, next to the pencil, there is a travel brush we've been talking about. But then right next to all of them, there's a whole bunch of water brushes. They're brushes both made with organic material for the brush, sable or something like that, or in these cases, most of these are done with a polyester. And used to be polyester brushes, sort of synthetic brushes, were terrible. In the 60s and 70s and 80s, they were pretty bad. But they've gotten really pretty good as sort of the chemistry of plastics has gotten really very good at making things that fit a little bit more into being like a natural brush. And the neat thing is with these, you don't have to carry water with you. What they've got is you've got a palette over there, palette, pencil, maybe a pen, and then you're carrying your water in the brush itself. There's some things it won't do, making big washes, but maybe you don't need it because you're doing very small sketches and covering small areas. By the way, right above that little circular piece up there on the right, above the palette, that's actually a little palette of water-soluble graphite. We might talk about that a little bit later. It's a kind of a fun tool to work with watercolor. Here, on the left, there's a little small palette, a water brush, and you can see the color there and some paper towel. And this is a close-up look on the right at a couple of water brushes. The caps have been removed so that you can see the tips. They're polyester tips in each of these cases. They'll start off bright white. They will stain with some other, you'll put it in a color that it stains, but once the end is stained, don't worry. That green or the yellow or the red that stains the polyester tip, it's not going to come back out when you're mixing a yellow or something light. It's just going to stain it, and that'll be fine. Now, a lot of watercolor sketchers love to work with pen when they're outside as well, mixing that with watercolor. We saw that in some of the earlier sketching we saw at the beginning of this presentation. Well, if you're wanting to work with ink, you might be wanting to work with a brush or a dip pen, the metal ones at the top, the bamboo pens that are in the middle there. I've got each of those in my studio, and I love to sketch with those. I loved, when I was much younger, I would take bottles of ink out and sketch, and might have my watercolor there as well. In fact, plenty of times I would just be sketching with a brush and a dip pen and maybe a wooden pen because of the different kind of marks they make. That's great, but I carried bottles of ink, and that can be really dangerous. Um, it's not dangerous to you or to me, but it's dangerous to our clothes. Bottles of ink, closing them up, if you don't get them completely closed, well, when they turn sideways and they begin to leak. Or if something gets banged around in the wrong way, you suddenly got a broken glass where tons of ink is just pouring out of your bag or out of your pocket. You're ruining clothes, you're ruining your car, whatever's going on. So you have to be really careful with that. Now, that said, I'm not saying don't do that, because I certainly love it when I do it. But a lot of times we can substitute something else. Over on the right-hand side, there are brushes that come preloaded with ink, sort of like think of a water brush, but they're loaded with ink. You can also go get an empty water brush and put your own ink in it. You can put it whatever kind of ink you want. And there's certainly an imitation of the dip pen is the fountain pen. And we also have mechanical pens that just come preloaded with ink. So there's a lot of choices you have in terms of inks. And you can choose pens that have permanent inks and water-soluble inks, both, or either one. So, and that's a lot of fun to look at, and then I'll be glad to give you some more information about that going forward. So, just because we like watercolor doesn't mean it always has to be from paint. Here are two ideas with water brushes in both. These two artists' kits, one on the right has watercolor pencils. That means the watercolor pigment is actually formed into a pencil. And they can put the pencil in water and make wet marks with the pencil itself. The water will run out eventually, of course, after that. But whatever you put down, you can also re-wet and then move around and create washes and fill in areas with a brush or a water brush. And on the left-hand side, those are watercolor crayons, pure watercolor pigment mashed together into sort of a crayon-like surface material, rather. And then you can take that and draw with it, move it around. You can wet the paper first if you want to and draw with it. It gives you really intense color that way. Or you can put water on afterwards and move it around in very delicate manners if you wish. And you see here again that graphite, that round thing above the watercolor pencils. That's the graphite, the water-soluble graphite that I was talking to you about before, which can be used. It's a dry material that wets and then you can move around very easily with a brush. So whatever you're going to be working with, whatever tools you are loving, take those with you. Whether it includes a bottle of ink, as you see on the one down there with the little Winsor Newton watercolor ink blue that you might see there. Yeah, that's perfectly legit. Or the one you see up above it with the little Sucret's tin with the paint just in there, not even using those little pans, just using the paint directly, and a micron pen, very waterproof ink, and then a water brush, and then their sketchbook. So whatever materials you want to experiment with when you're at home or out, just pare it down, make it simple. Don't overdo it. Don't carry too much, because if you carry too much, you're going to get in the way of keeping things simple and direct and concentrating on the image and the mark making you're making. Don't worry too much about having everything. So choose your gear. Choose a way to get it around easily. A plastic shopping bag, fine. A shoulder bag. Don't have to carry lots and lots of stuff. A brush, some color, some paper in a pad or in a panel, or it doesn't really matter. But choose the things that are really good for you. Choose the colors that are really exciting for you to use. Keep it simple so that you don't overdo things. The palettes you see here above, there's a little gray case there that they're working on. and they've got two palettes up top. I'll show you those in class. They're from an artist out, I think, in Vancouver. And this artist, the particular artist who's got those, has loaded them up with the colors they want to use. And notice they're using actually the little metal cups up at the top that has a clip on the bottom of it that allows them to clip it onto their board. Their board looks like it's coroplastic. Basically, it's a plastic version of foam core. So you can use a foam core board to put your paper on if you want to, or you can use a hardback sketchbook and that'll be fine. Or you can, I use old masonite because I had a bunch of sheets of masonite cut up years ago. But coroplast or foam core, even hard tag board, kind of cardboard, you can work on top of. Anything just to keep it straight and simple and easy to work with and make it easy to carry. You might end up with a palette and a sketchbook and 2 pens and 3 water brushes and a palette's got lots of color. That's fine. Whatever you want to do, you want to be able to fit it into something that's easy to carry, easy to load into your car or in your back. This is a nice shoulder bag with plenty of stuff. It's got extra gear in it too. It's got some things that you might not think are all that important. Me, I always have to carry sunscreen with me because I burn so easily. If I'm out in the countryside and I'm out in the middle of a field, I better have some spray to keep bugs off of me. It's not so much the mosquitoes I'm worried about. They'll itch for a couple of days, but I certainly don't need any tick-borne diseases out there. So you might need different kinds of gear, sunglasses, a phone, etc. Whatever it is you want and need to carry. But whatever it is that you need to carry, your kit can be extensive or extremely sparse. It kind of depends on how lightly you want or need to travel, or even just your mood that particular day. But that's all we need to worry about. Making it fit you. Making it fit so that you can carry your materials, that you're going to be safe. This gear is a lot like mine. There's 2 sketchbooks here. There's some clips. There's a phone. There's a little pocket knife. There's a couple of pens and pencils. There's something to sharpen your pencils with. A couple of erasers, some paper towels, some brushes, and then a bag to throw it all into. So that's basically it, guys. From there, that's my intro for the moment. And let me wrap it up by coming back on screen.
Well, that wraps that particular video material up. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to email me or even text me if you've got the number and ask me questions about materials. I'm always glad to talk about it. Don't be surprised to see some more videos coming your way, some live and some like that one that are sort of converted with pieces of photography and video all mixed together about sketching supplies, sketching materials, and approaches to sketching, whether you're working with ink or other materials. I like posting about that. I like writing about it. I like talking about it. It's one of my good geeky subjects. Anyway, thank you guys for coming. I hope everybody stays well, and I'll look forward to talking to you again soon. Take care.